Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's special episode of Low Season Traveller Insider Guides. I'm Jed Brown, founder of Low Season Traveller, and since I started this podcast in 2018, my objective has always been to provide low season travel destination insights and, in addition, to give our audience the inside track on the global travel industry. As this week's episode coincides with World Tourism Day, there is no better guest to help us to understand the state of the travel industry today, as well as what the future holds, than Carolyn Childs. Carolyn is CEO of My Travel Research and is one of the travel industry's foremost futurists and strategists. She works with governments and tourism bodies to help them to identify, understand and plan for the current and future trends in the global travel industry. And this week she was a guest speaker at the Future Travel Experience Show in London. Enjoy. So a very good afternoon, Carolyn Childs. Great to have you on the show.
And it's great to be here, Jed. Thanks for having me on.
It's wonderful to be speaking to you. And just so we can set the scene appropriately, I'm in my little soundproof booth in Manchester, and it's a beautiful sunny day. Now, you live in Sydney, of course, Carolyn, but you're not in Sydney. Where are you today?
I'm actually sat at the heart of the New Forest, so a few degrees south of you, Jed. So I'm the other side of the north-south divide.
Wow, fair play to you. Well, you what I call it is the deep south is where you are, actually.
Yes, if we were talking Game of Thrones terms, I'm in Dawn or Highgarden, and you're actually up close to the wall, aren't you?
Very close indeed. Well, listen, wonderful to have you here. Let's get straight into it. For our listeners out there that have not come across you, you've been active in the global travel industry for quite some time now. And I was just wondering if you could set the scene and tell us about your journey in the global travel industry so far.
Yes, I'm going to own up. I can say this, Jed. I've been in the industry now for 31 years.
Oh,
and yes, it's quite scary. There are literally people probably alive listening to this call who weren't born when I entered it. I think like a lot of people, I fell into it by accident. I had a languages background, and I was working in Insight, and a job came up in a consultancy. And it's funny because people these days talk about portfolio careers, but every day is different in travel and when you're looking at and thinking about travel. So, my journey through that, initially most of my work was in the airline industry. And that was what took me from the UK, which most people will still be able to hear as originally my home, to Australia, was to go and run a company that looked after understanding the mind of business travelers on behalf of major airline brands. And then from there, I let's just say I looked at a business that has about 80% of its revenue derived from the aviation industry. The day after 9/11, and decided that wasn't the right thing. So I gradually broadened it out into tourism work and did more and more of that. And now I'd say it's probably the other way around. In fact, probably more like 90% of my time is spent on tourism, particularly very often working with destinations, and particularly small destinations down at the local level. I mean, I work with everyone all the way up to the Tourism Australias of this world. But probably if I think of, they'd be the big clients that I work with on the larger projects. But then I do a lot of work with, little local government areas, because the curious thing is that the problems and challenges that a Tourism Australia is facing is not in some ways that different from the problem that a Bathurst or a, New Forest District Council might be facing.
So what are the kind of projects that you get involved in, and how do you help these different tourism authorities around the world?
Well, all sorts of different ways, really. I increasingly where I'm seeing a lot of my work. So there's broadly kind of two sides to it. So one is that more kind of bespoke stuff. So for example, at the moment, I'm working with one of the states in Australia, and they're trying to build an index of information to make their thinking about tourism policy a little bit more forward thinking, right? Because, we all know traditionally there are these measures of, visitor numbers and expenditure. But what they said was if we could get a little bit ahead of the curve and start to pick up when there are alarm bells ringing in the economy, either because we've got too many people coming or not enough people coming. What if we constructed a more complex measure and we could work out which levers we needed to pull? So they've pulled all of the kind of, the big economic statistics, and my job is to come in and be the interface and bring in the voice of the travel industry. What are their sentiments? What are they looking for government to do? I do a lot of brand development and destination development work. So, for example, I made a reference to Bathurst, LGA. I work with them on setting up their destination branding strategy and looking at, what they needed to be thinking about there. I do a lot of desk research projects for clients or helping clients do their own research projects. So I work with the government of Hawaii, trying to understand how they could get more Australians to come to Hawaii and how they could get to the next stage, because they've been very successful at growing the market. And they really wanted to say, well, okay, we don't want to rest on our laurels. How can we go deeper and build a stronger relationship? So we went away and actually used some very fun and innovative artificial intelligence type research tools to dive a little bit deeper into what people might be interested in and why. So that's kind of one side. And the other side is more kind of servicing people who don't have big budgets and looking at things like major long-term trends. So we do a lot of work with people, helping them try and future-proof their destinations or their businesses by trying to pick through and help them identify the trends that they need to work with.
That's interesting when you say the long-term trends. What's again, for our listeners out there as well as for myself, what's long-term? What kind of a period is long-term these days?
Well, what we try and do is it's curious because I actually spoke at a research conference this year, and I said, when does the future begin? Because literally, of course, the future actually begins less than a nanosecond away. So the first thing I try and do is understand what's the capability that people have to plan longer term. Because we know that most people are stuck on the hamster wheel. They're looking a quarter ahead. They're looking a year ahead. If we're lucky, they're looking 5 to 10 years ahead. And mostly I get people to work within those kind of frameworks. But what I do try and encourage them to do is project forward a little bit further than that so that they can bring some of that longer term thinking every day. So basically I say to people, try and get people to use tools and techniques where I said, well, okay, I know it sounds impossible, but what if you had a 50-year plan or a 100-year plan? Mm-hmm. What would you do differently? And similarly, I also have a technique where I get people to do almost kind of a back to the future thing, which is if you could travel back in time and change things, what would you do differently now? And then get them to use some of that thinking forward. So generally the answer to your question, Jed, is as far out as I can get them to plan, but recognizing that, they've got to, be putting bread and butter together and getting the money coming in now. Yep.
Absolutely. When you say, I love that. I love the fact that you start to say, look, if you could go back in time, what would you change? What kind of answers do you get for that? Is there any sort of common threads on that?
Well, I think one of the things is that people wish that they'd stepped outside their comfort zone a little bit more. I think the first one is understanding the customer a lot better, mm-hmm. because many people come into travel and tourism and they do it not because they love working with customers or working with people, but because they're passionate about their specific area. So, they might be passionate about, hill walking. So they start a hill walking company. So I think one of the things that I think when we get people to do that is I think they wish that they'd done that. I don't think I've ever had anyone say they wish they'd never done it. That I think can in itself be a useful thing because tourism is a hard-working industry. We have this image of we're very glossy and it's all about fun. But behind that, we've got that classic analogy of the swan on the lake. So it all looks like that beautiful on the surface for a visitor, hopefully, but people are paddling away underneath. So sometimes it can actually help people reinvigorate and remind them why they're doing what they do. But I think typically we'll find things like understanding certain things about the customer and how the customer interacts with what they're doing. I literally had one tourism manager who told me it changed her life when she sat and listened to a focus group and she watched someone interact with her brochure that she thought was fantastic, and she saw their reaction and saw it through their eyes. So again, that looking through other eyes or through other perspectives is a big part of what we do.
Yeah, very very scary actually, I would imagine, in some ways, when you're confronted with the consumer opinion on your on your brand or on your brochure, like you say. This lady obviously pours blood, sweat and tears into that, and it's probably trashed in an instant, which has got to be kind of hear that,
and that's one of the things I quite often will say to people early in the process, particularly if they're looking to make big step changes, is to congratulate them and revalidate that decision for them, because it is hard to change. I mean, we all do this in our businesses. When I get to the end of a project, I'll sit down and do a feedback session with the client, and it's incredibly valuable, but it's still incredibly terrifying. Because even if people are saying nice things, they're coming at it from such a different place from you. But when you do learn those things and you apply them, it's so empowering. And that's what I see a lot, is people tell me how empowering it is when they've got that voice of the customer coming into what they're doing, and they can see that it works and it gets them results.
Absolutely. When we talk about, I mean, you were saying that you've been in the industry for, a very long time. And obviously that, you must have seen a massive amount of change in the general global travel and tourism industry over the years. What do you think have been the most significant changes that you've witnessed over the past 30 odd years?
Well, I think there's no conversation we can have about this where we don't look at the rise of the emerging markets, particularly in Asia Pacific, Jed, and particularly, the 10-pound gorilla in the room, China. And I think that's one where, for me, not only the growth of China, but the fact that China didn't follow the traditional playbook of how you go from being an emerging tourism source market to being a mature one. That classic, you do anything's wonderful. You go there, you're not doing immersive, you're not doing cultural, you just want to pack as much in as possible, through to the more, deep, spend more time in places. China, no one told China there's a playbook like that. Yep. So they're finding ways to do deeply immersive experiences in incredibly short spaces of time. And they're challenging us as an industry to find a way to do that apparent paradox of, deep, meaningful, immersive, unique experiences, but not done on the time frames that we traditionally thought about that. So that, for me, is, I think, one of the consistently fascinating things that I've seen. I think the other one is the journey that we've had as an industry to changing perceptions of that, kind of, because people see it as a fun industry, they don't take it seriously. So I think probably the change I've seen in the last 5 to 10 years is governments really starting to wake up to the fact that we're not just fun. Obviously, we are fun, but that we are a serious industry that is a major contributor to well-being, particularly well-being in outside capital city areas and regional areas, which is something that I think is important. And the fact that we are, not only are we employers, but we're employers of everyone. From somebody getting their first job out of school right up to, the chief executive of a Visit Britain or a Tourism Australia, that we are such an important part of the global economy and a growing part of the global economy.
Yeah, I believe it's something like, it was the WTTC, I think, came up with a study a while back, and it was something like 11% of the world's GDP comes from travel and tourism, and I think 1 in 10 jobs worldwide is linked to travel and tourism. And like you say, it doesn't seem to get the attention that the automotive industry gets, or any of these other sort of industries over the years.
Yes, and I think that's partly because we're such a fragmented industry. We're lots of small voices. And, if you're dealing with the automotive industry, well, I mean, even if it's most disaggregated, you're probably dealing with 10 companies globally. If you look at tourism, you'd probably be dealing with, well, not even 10,000, it'd probably be more like 1 million companies globally. So I think we've had all those classic problems of getting people to recognize that. And I think the other thing that people hadn't always recognized was how much we're embedded in the broader service economy. So now I know in policy terms, we no longer talk about the tourism industry all the time. We talk about the visitor economy. And I think it's an ugly phrase and it's not yet fully accepted. But what I do say to people is it's a phrase that enables policymakers to take what we're doing seriously and to start thinking and planning for us. And I mean, living in Australia, this has been very large with us as we come off the back of the resources boom. You know, when people were paying amazing prices for things like iron ore, as we're transitioning to a post-carbon economy where we've earned a lot of our wealth from carbon, to trading off, you know, against what tourism can do and how it can actually step into doing that. So those are some of the changes, I think. Obviously, we could talk about how digital marketing and increasingly things like artificial intelligence are starting to change how we do things, the rise of social media. I mean, what I always say with social media is all I think it did was it created a new way of doing things that we actually always really wanted to do. And that's actually why it was so successful. It wasn't that it necessarily changed what we did, but it just made sure more of us could do those things.
It's interesting, actually, when we talk about social media. A lot of people recently, I've seen a few different articles and different opinion pieces in the sort of the main newspaper press, certainly over here in the UK, where different travel editors, etc., are really having a pop at, in particular, Instagram, but social media generally, on being the root cause of the over-tourism problem, which we sort of seem to have today. And what's your take on that?
Well, I think the problem is what we're actually blaming is the vehicle, because all of us, I think when we're honest, we all want bragging rights for things, don't we, Jed? We all want to be the person who did that amazing, cool experience. We all want to position ourselves as, Marco Polo or Ibn Battuta going out and doing that travel. So we've always wanted those bragging rights and that capture of experiences right back to the photo. I mean, it would be as relevant to say that the photo was a driver of over-tourism. It just was a much earlier stage of it. So I think when we look at Instagram and those things, we should be looking at what's the motivation. If we want to change that behavior and get people to behave in better ways and get people to use the spaces at major iconic sites better, it's not the technology we need to be changing, it's the human interface of that change.
Yeah, absolutely. Agree completely. I mean, on that, what's your broad take on over-tourism? We're seeing so much now. So I have Google Alerts set as part of my due diligence, I guess, with Low Season Traveller. I have my Google Alerts set, and one of the terms which I search for and comes up on my report every morning at 7 a.m. is anything that's mentioned on over-tourism in any articles that are published online. And
you must have a full inbox.
Yeah, no, really, I do. But what's interesting to me is, there's 7 or 8 articles every single day that are published about over-tourism. And, my take on this when I speak to, friends down the pub, family members, etc., is they kind of have heard of over-tourism, but they're not really sort of sure, exactly how bad it is or anything else. What's your take on over-tourism? What's your take on the severity of it? And what's your take on the path that we're on going into the future with regards to over-tourism?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I would never underestimate the impact of the most heavily over-touristed destinations. I cannot imagine what it must be like for some of the, you can see why the reactions of people like Barcelona and Venice, where they feel like they've lost the soul of their place. And ironically, the thing that tourists themselves want to come and experience is that kind of local. But again, coming back to that human interface point, Jed, I heard a great quote recently from the head of the chair of entrepreneurship at Victoria University down in Australia, and he said, you get that phone call where you send the phone call and say, I'm late because I'm stuck in traffic. He said, what you have to remember is at that point, you are the traffic, or more importantly, you are that person. So I think on the consumer side, it's about us reflecting, if we don't like seeing lots of people there, why are we going to places and going to at times of year where there are going to be a lot of people there? it's not reasonable to say I should have the privilege of going to Venice and walking across St. Mark's Square in the morning when there's no one else there but the cleaners and 5 Italians having a coffee, but no one else is allowed to do that. So I think that's where we start to think about it. And I guess that's why I'm so excited with what you're doing with Low Season Traveller, because it is about getting people to think about another dimension of a destination, which is not just the place, but also the time. That, you can go at a different time and have a different experience. Yes, you're not necessarily going to get sunny blue skies and walk around in your shorts, but you're making a different trade-off. And I think we need to do that. So on the customer side, I think if we don't like over-tourism, it starts with you. It starts with a look in the mirror and what your own behavior is and can you behave as a tourist in other ways. But I think on the other side of it, what we've now seen and what we're waking up, and I believe we are going to get there, I think we can do this, is that we're taking a more holistic view of destination management. So, a few years ago, every the M stood for marketing, whereas now we're talking about destination management. We're thinking more strategically about place and about the way that we think about and manage the process, and recognizing that, because tourism is so embedded in the broader economy and it's such a complex system that it touches a lot of things. So you can't just keep bringing people in and the problem will sort itself out. So I think we're on that journey of making that happen. And, interesting ways we're using technology. So I look at somewhere like Vienna, where they're using Wi-Fi markers to be able to try and almost divert people to say, look, don't stand for 4 hours and get annoyed in a queue for the Schönbrunn Palace. Move here and do this now because it's quiet. And places, Vienna does this, I know, Bay of Plenty in New Zealand, Kristen Dunn, who's a real inspirational leader in doing this, reclassifying visitors so that they look at them as short-term residents or short-term stakeholders in place, so that people actually have a sense of ownership of the solution as well as their personal experience. So I think, is it a serious problem? Yes. Is it a universal problem? No. Many places have over-tourism, but there are lots of places in the world that would love to see more visitors. I look at destination. Last week, the BBC were reporting that South Sudan is looking at tourism as a way to help them build their economy post-war. And I can't think of a better industry to help a destination like South Sudan. I mean, yes, initially it's going to be very brave travellers who come in and do that, but the amount of infrastructure that those type of travellers will need will be quite modest. The money, if it's planned and executed properly, will immediately flow to local people. Mm-hmm. And more importantly, after decades of war, having people who come in and value what you have can actually, I think, revalidate and rebuild people's own belief in what they've got. So I think a Lonely Planet a few years ago did a thing where they looked at over-tourism, but they looked at, I think, about 20 places that they said were the most under-touristed in the world. Now, I don't actually think they looked at South Sudan because it was during a period of war. But I look at something like that and say, well, look, we're not necessarily going to solve this by making it evil. And I do have a concern when we talk about this in a way that unless we're not traveling ourselves, we shouldn't be criticizing other people for traveling, and that we morally disapprove of that behavior. I think, again, we have to come back to finding a way to make it people have a sense of ownership of the solution and the place, which is why I love things like what Bay of Plenty have done, of saying, we're all residents. Even if I'm a resident for a night or for a few hours on a day trip, I have a sense of stake in this place.
I love that, and it's something that I've referred to a few times. And the irony is, I think, as travellers, I think we, in many cases, the reason that we travel is we want to experience what life is like in that destination, and as such, we almost want to be a temporary resident. And therefore, as an industry, for us to sort of recognise that that's what people are looking for sometimes, and they're looking for that authentic experience. That's certainly something that resonates with me. But one other thing, when we're talking about those places, and I take your point that it's not universal, this over-tourism, but there are certain pockets where it exists. Is that largely down to mismanagement? And I don't mean that in a derogatory way. We've all been learning as we go, and we all have to deal with with new sort of trends and shifts in visitor arrivals, etc. But is it down to mismanagement, and therefore, in the work that you're doing at My Travel Research, is a lot of this about making sure that the destinations that you work with are recognizing that it needs to be carefully managed from the outset as they begin their journey as being a tourist destination, in order to make sure that they guard against over-tourism for the future?
Yes, definitely. I think one of the things there, and we talked about this idea of doing scenario planning, and I'm a huge, so the techniques I use with people are inspired by Rick Antonson, talk about cathedral thinking, what are you building for your grandchildren? We talked about Back to the Future, but the third one is scenario planning, which is, what is this going to look like if you succeed? Not just that, suddenly you've got, lower unemployment, but how are you actually going to manage when you've got that many people coming through? And what's going to be your plan when you reach your goal, so that almost you never let people sit still. So that's really a lot of what we do try and get people to do, is not for us to come in as consultants and tell them, but for them to take this and work with them to get those exercises. As I say, what is this place? I'll actually do techniques like guided visualizations with people, where I'll get them to imagine what it's going to be like when they get that many people there.
Yeah.
And the other thing that we will do is spend a lot of time doing, it's curious. It's one of the most valuable things I do, but it's one of the hardest to get clients to pay for, because it basically means me coming in and walking around and experiencing things for a couple of days. But the things that you see on the ground, where you can see all of those snag points come out, I think that's something that we definitely do spend quite a lot of time trying to say to people, both for under tourism and over tourism. So I remember going to visit a region I was working with on the coast of New South Wales, and we went to visit one attraction, and their sign on the road said that they weren't open that day. We rolled up and they didn't realise it was us, and I said, "Oh, we're sorry to disturb you on your clothes, we're here to do this immersion." They said, "Oh no, we are open." You took me going, well, how would the average consumer know that? So there are all of those things where we haven't updated that sign yet. I hear we haven't got round to it yet comment a lot. And it's like, okay, you're looking at that as, I just need to update that sign. To the consumer, that sign is telling me I do or don't have permission to do this. So I remember I worked with a national park that had been formerly a state forest. We designated a national park. They hadn't updated the signs again. And I said, okay, you look at that, and that's like, tells them which way to go. We just need to update it when we get money. What that tells me as a consumer is I can come in and collect firewood. I can bring my dog. Yeah, I can go where I want, because I'm using that sign in a different way from you, which is why also always putting the voice of the customer and seeing it through the customer's eyes is what we try and do to build that sense of that. And consulting the community, because I think that's one of the other things that we forget, is that if we're talking about somebody who's there for a few hours as a resident, that we need to bring that broader voice of the community in. And particularly for small destinations, that can be a challenge, because we always know there are a few loud voices. So I do see part of my job is to create tools and techniques and work with clients to bring quieter voices in, to bring how would this work? Because often there are people there going, well, actually, we would like to see more people, because that they do recognise it would mean their kids would have a job. Or if they're running a small business, it does mean that the petrol station might stay open, or the news agents might still stay open, because there's enough custom coming through.
Yeah. In general, are you optimistic for the travel industry?
On balance, yes, I am.
Yeah.
There are times when we all feel despair, and we'd have to say, Jed, for those people listening, we are talking today on the day of the global climate strike. Yeah. And there are those moments, but I actually think this is that moment where we have that choice, and we've recognized that we have a choice. We've got that understanding of the complexity. We've got the examples of what goes wrong, and we have people who are hungry to make that change. So yes, on balance, I would say cautiously optimistic, because we know that the forces of inertia are strong, and the forces of life where, the thing about I do want to eat healthily and eat fruit and veg, but gosh, that chocolate eclair looks nice. Those things are all there, but we've never been in a better position to understand both ourselves and to use the tools of technology to help us, work out what we can do. And we can try things and fail so much faster than we used to. For all the things that people say, that philosophy of move fast and break things, try this, see if it works. If it doesn't work, let's move on to the next solution. We're getting more and more knowledge to do that with. So on balance, I believe I am optimistic that we can solve our problems and that we can play a stronger role. I mean, I think are you familiar with the work of the Institute of Peace through Tourism?
Yes.
There used to be that old thing about no two countries that had a McDonald's ever went to war, but they've actually proved that there is definitely a peace dividend from tourism, and that for all the challenges of people who look very different to us suddenly invading, interesting word, our areas, that actually tourism brings people together who would not otherwise get to encounter one another, and that builds understanding and engagement with the world. So I guess that's another reason for me to feel optimistic about things, that we have the evidence that we can do this and it does make a difference.
Absolutely. It's interesting when you when you talk about the the increased opportunity for peace worldwide and the greater cultural understanding. And that's for my personal point of view, that's one of the reasons that I loved the travel industry when I first got involved myself, was because the more I traveled, the more I understood about the world, and the more I understood about different cultures, and the more I wanted to learn even more about different cultures. And actually, that was one of the very early starting points for Low Season Traveller was, I want my two daughters to also benefit from being able to travel around the world and to learn about different cultures and to have a greater understanding of this one small, beautiful planet that we live on. And at the time, I say it was about this time last year, I was just nervous that, maybe it won't be that good. I'm not pessimistic by nature. I am optimistic, but I think that we've got a lot to do. And, we've never been better informed on all of the challenges that the planet has as we are today. And I guess, we can't claim ignorance anymore. It's, as you pointed out there, it's all within our grasp. It's just whether we choose to grasp it, really, the opportunity.
I'd agree.
Yeah, and we're running low on time, so I did want to before you go, I wanted to quickly do some quick fire questions. If you're ready,
absolutely
up for it. Okay, your earliest travel memory?
Going to Scotland, to a seaside town called Largs. And it was the first holiday we'd been able to afford since my parents split up. And it was absolutely magical. So we drove up. I remember going and seeing Loch Lomond. And you talked about those moments, Jed, where you have that aha moment. Being there when kids had come out from the slums of Largs, so we were in a small town called Largs, so kids had come out from the town of Largs, and my family had been through obviously some quite challenging times, but to see someone whose situation was so much worse than ours was that moment of realizing how privileged I was. So that's one of my earliest travel memories.
I love that. Where's the best place that you've ever woken up?
Best place that I've ever woken up. It's like a good mother can't pick favorites. Some magical moments for me, waking up at Annapurna Base Camp in Kathmandu.
Oh, wow.
Going for a wake up and a morning run around Uluru in the Red Centre, which is somewhere everyone should visit.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Trying to think of some city experiences. Now, that moment when you wake up and you look at, waking up in a little attic hotel room in Paris and seeing the Eiffel Tower out the window. For me, there's just too many. As I said, every one of those travel experiences is special for me in different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you never leave home without? So whenever you travel, what's that sort of, one extra little thing that you would always bring with you, whether it be a small luxury or a small personal item that is for you essential for your sanity when you're on your road?
Something to read.
Right. Kindle? Or are you old school books?
Both. Well, it depends where you're going. So I did a trip in Tanzania where we had a 15-kilo luggage allowance, and a Kindle is great in that situation. But there's something about the idea of sitting somewhere, particularly on a long bus journey, and, the feel of paper under your fingers. So books for me is one, and probably the other one would be who I'm traveling with. Not that I'm not a solo traveler occasionally, but, having travel companions with you is the one I try not to leave home without.
Very good. If you could be anywhere in the world right now, other than where you are, obviously, where would you be?
Antarctica. That's my number one destination. But later this year, I'm visiting one of my other must-sees, which is Ethiopia. So either of those would be, if you could wave your magic wand and take me to those, Jed, I'd be extremely happy.
I'd be happy to go with you on either of those, to be fair, Carol. I've never been to either, but I've heard very good things, in particular about Ethiopia, actually. It's something I'd be absolutely fascinated to visit. But one day.
Yes.
What has been your biggest travel surprise? What I mean by that, Carolyn, is if there's been any destinations where your expectations before going there were a bit, but when you got there, you were like, wow, that is way better than I could have imagined, actually. Travel surprise.
Nashville in Tennessee. In fact, I actually wrote a blog piece where I compared Nashville syndrome to Paris syndrome. So you're familiar with Paris syndrome, which is people are disappointed when they get there because it's been their dream city. I was supposed to be going with friends to Nashville after a conference. They were all big fans, big country music fans, all of that stuff. I was just tagging along just to be with friends, and they had to drop out. So not only was I going to somewhere I never wanted to go in the first place, but I was actually going on my own. And I loved it. I had an absolute ball. Still not a country music fan, but there was so much live music. There's actually a lot of very fascinating Civil War history. Tennessee obviously was at the heart of that. I did a tour from the slaves' point of view at a plantation where the ancestors, if you're into horse racing, the ancestors of many of the great American racehorses went to. And as I said, Nashville syndrome is that thing that you're talking about, the destination that was your surprise destination that you never expected to enjoy and absolutely loved.
Absolutely. I absolutely love that. Carolyn, there we are out of time, I'm afraid. I want to just say a huge thank you so much for being so generous with your time and for taking time out of your day today. I know that this afternoon you're off to the climate strike, right?
I was hoping to. I think I just missed my little slot on that, but I'm hoping to pick up at the end of it. But yes, I'm hoping to do so, yes.
Well, we hope you make it. But listen, thank you so much for joining us. And hopefully you can join us again, maybe around this time next year, and we can have another update and have another little conversation with you then and see what shape the world is in then.
No problem. Thanks so much for letting me talk so much about something I'm so passionate about, and great questions, Jed. Thank you.
Oh, thanks a million. All the best, Carolyn. And that's a wrap. Thanks again for your company this week, and I'd really love to hear your thoughts on the topics we covered in today's podcast. And if there are any destinations, topics or guests you think we should feature, then please do drop me a line at jed@lowseasontraveller.com. If you're enjoying the podcasts, I'd really appreciate it if you could take the time to leave us a quick review on iTunes and indeed share the podcast with your friends and family. We are the world's first organisation entirely dedicated to only promoting travel during the low seasons in each destination as a means of alleviating the growing burden of over-tourism. And that's why our content will always be free for everyone, as we believe that travel is better without the crowds.